In the year 1519, beneath the shadow of towering volcanoes and across the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco, stood one of the greatest cities the world had ever seen. Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, stretched across artificial islands connected by magnificent causeways, its pyramids painted in brilliant reds and blues, rising like monuments to the gods themselves. Home to nearly 250,000 souls, it rivaled Paris and Venice in size and splendor. Yet within 2 short years, this mighty civilization would lie in ruins. How could an empire that ruled over 5 million people, that commanded tribute from hundreds of city-states, fall to a handful of foreign invaders? The answer lies not in superior weapons or divine intervention, but in a perfect storm of disease, betrayal, and strategic brilliance that would reshape the new world forever. The story begins not with conquest, but with magnificence. By 1519, the Aztec Empire had reached heights that would have impressed even the greatest rulers of Europe. From their island capital, the Aztecs controlled a vast network of tribute states, stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. Tenochtitlan itself was a marvel of engineering and urban planning that left visitors speechless. The city rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco like something from a dream, connected to the mainland by 3 massive causeways that could be defended by lifting removable bridges. 2 sophisticated aqueducts, each stretching over 4 kilometers, carried fresh mountain water directly into the heart of the metropolis. The sacred precinct at the city's center could hold more than 8,000 worshippers within its towering walls. Markets bustled with goods from across the empire, cocoa beans from the tropical lowlands, precious feathers from exotic birds, obsidian blades sharper than Spanish steel, and gold worked into intricate ornaments by master craftsmen. The population was diverse and specialized. Farmers tended floating gardens called chinampas. Warriors trained in kalmakaks, the military schools that produced the empire's fearsome jaguar and eagle knights. Priests conducted the complex rituals that kept the cosmic order in balance. This was not some primitive society waiting to be civilized. This was one of the most sophisticated urban centers on Earth. Yet beneath this splendor lay the seeds of the empire's destruction. The Aztec system of rule was built on tribute and fear. Conquered peoples were forced to send regular payments of goods, labor, and even human lives to feed the empire's appetite. While this system generated enormous wealth for Tenochtitlan, it also bred resentment among subject peoples who chafed under Aztec dominance. The Tlaxcalans, completely surrounded by Aztec territory, had fought a series of bitter wars to maintain their independence. The Totonacs along the coast groaned under heavy tribute demands. Countless other groups watched for any opportunity to throw off the yoke of Aztec rule. The empire's greatest strength, its vast size and diverse population, would ultimately become its greatest vulnerability. Into this world of political tension and simmering rebellion came a man whose name would echo through history. Hernán Cortés was no ordinary conquistador. Born into minor Spanish nobility in 1485, he possessed a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and charisma that would prove devastating to the Aztec world. When Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, commissioned Cortés to explore the Mexican coast in 1518, he could never have imagined the consequences of that decision. Cortés was supposed to trade, explore, and return. Instead, he would launch one of the most audacious conquests in human history. On the 22nd of April 1519, 11 Spanish galleons dropped anchor off the coast of what is now Mexico. From their wooden decks emerged a force that seemed laughably small by Aztec standards. 450 Spanish soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, and a handful of cannons. By the numbers alone, this expedition should have been nothing more than a minor irritation to an empire of millions. Yet Cortés understood something that many conquerors before and since have missed. Victory is not always about numbers. It is about leverage, timing, and the ability to exploit your enemy's weaknesses. The Spanish possessed certain technological advantages, but these were not as overwhelming as popular myth suggests. Their steel weapons were superior to obsidian, but Aztec warriors were skilled and numerous. Their horses were terrifying to people who had never seen them, but they were few and vulnerable. Their cannons were impressive, but they had limited ammunition and were difficult to move through rough terrain. The real Spanish advantage lay not in their technology, but in their diseases and their diplomatic cunning. Cortés's first stroke of genius came in his treatment of indigenous peoples. Rather than simply conquering everyone in his path, he listened, learned, and adapted. When his small force landed, they encountered the Totonacs, who were groaning under Aztec tribute demands. Instead of fighting them, Cortés offered them something the Aztecs never had: partnership rather than subjugation. The Totonacs, desperate to escape Aztec dominance, became his first allies. Through them, he learned about the political landscape of the region and gained his most valuable asset, a woman known as Doña Marina, or La Malinche. La Malinche spoke both the local Mayan dialects and Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. More than just a translator, she became Cortés's cultural interpreter, helping him understand the complex political relationships that held the Aztec Empire together. Through her, he learned about the resentments of subject peoples, the religious beliefs that might be exploited, and the roots that led to the heart of Aztec power. Without La Malinche, the Spanish conquest would likely have failed before it truly began. But it was Cortés's encounter with the Tlaxcalans that truly set the stage for what was to come. When the Spanish force entered Tlaxcalan territory in August 1519, they met fierce resistance. For 2 weeks, these proud warriors tested the Spanish in battle, proving themselves worthy opponents despite facing horses, steel, and gunpowder for the first time. The fighting was brutal and costly for both sides. Yet when Cortés finally proposed an alliance, the Tlaxcalan leaders saw an opportunity they had dreamed of for generations. Here was a chance to destroy their hated enemies, the Aztecs, once and for all. The Tlaxcalan decision to ally with the Spanish would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in human history. These were not a few hundred warriors joining Cortés. This was a nation of 150,000 people, battle-hardened by decades of conflict with the Aztecs, throwing their full support behind the Spanish cause. Suddenly, Cortés's small expedition had become something far more dangerous: a coalition army capable of challenging Aztec supremacy. Meanwhile, in Tenochtitlan, disturbing reports reached the court of Emperor Moctezuma II. Strangers with pale skin and beards had arrived from the Eastern Sea, riding creatures never seen before, wielding weapons that thundered like storms. The timing could not have been more ominous. According to Aztec prophecy, this was Cuauhtémoc, the year 1 Reed, when the feathered serpent god Quetzalcoatl was destined to return from his exile in the east. The physical descriptions of these strangers, their arrival from the predicted direction, and the cosmic significance of the year itself created a perfect storm of religious uncertainty. Moctezuma, a ruler who had expanded the empire to its greatest extent and commanded millions of subjects, found himself paralyzed by doubt. Were these visitors divine emissaries? Were they the fulfillment of ancient prophecy? Or were they simply foreign invaders who could be dealt with by conventional means? His hesitation, in the face of this unprecedented challenge, would prove fatal not just for him personally, but for his entire civilization. As Cortés and his growing army of Spanish conquistadors and indigenous allies advanced toward the Valley of Mexico, they left behind a trail of overturned alliances and shattered assumptions. City after city chose to join the coalition rather than face destruction. The Spanish promise of freedom from Aztec tribute proved more attractive than loyalty to distant Tenochtitlan. By November 1519, this coalition had grown into a force that dwarfed anything Cortés could have imagined when he first landed on Mexican shores. Tens of thousands of indigenous warriors marched alongside the Spanish, their hatred for Aztec rule burning as fiercely as any conquistador's lust for gold. The sound of their approach echoed across the volcanic peaks surrounding the Valley of Mexico like distant thunder, a drumbeat of vengeance that had been building for generations. Yet even as this massive army descended toward Lake Texcoco, Moctezuma made a decision that would haunt the Aztec people forever. Rather than marshalling his forces for battle, rather than using the natural defenses of his island capital, he chose to welcome the strangers as honored guests. On the 8th of November 1519, the causeways of Tenochtitlan witnessed one of history's most fateful processions. Moctezuma himself, adorned in the finest feathers and gold, led hundreds of nobles out to greet Cortés with ceremonies befitting divine visitors. The Spanish conquistador Bernal Díaz del Castillo captured the moment in words that still shimmer with wonder. When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, we were amazed and said it was like the enchantments they tell of in legend. Some of our soldiers even asked whether the things we saw were not a dream. The irony was crushing. Here was the greatest city in the Americas, opening its gates to the very forces that would destroy it. Cortés, whatever his other failings, possessed the instincts of a predator. He recognized opportunity when it presented itself. Within days of entering Tenochtitlan, he had seized Moctezuma himself, turning the emperor into a hostage in his own palace. Through a combination of audacity, psychological manipulation, and the ever-present threat of violence, the Spanish transformed the ruler of millions into their puppet. Moctezuma, still believing he might be dealing with divine forces, cooperated in his own subjugation. For months, this impossible situation held. A few hundred Spanish soldiers controlled the heart of a vast empire through their control of its emperor. They walked the streets of Tenochtitlan like conquerors, melting down priceless works of art for their gold content, demanding tribute from subject peoples, and gradually tightening their grip on the levers of power. The Aztec nobility watched in growing fury as their sacred ruler became a mouthpiece for foreign invaders. But even Cortés could not maintain such a precarious position indefinitely. In the spring of 1520, disturbing news reached him from the coast. Diego Velázquez, still furious that his subordinate had exceeded his authority, had sent another expedition under Pánfilo de Narváez to arrest Cortés and bring him back to Cuba in chains. Faced with this threat to his rear, Cortés made a calculated gamble. He would leave Tenochtitlan with most of his forces, defeat Narváez, and return with additional troops to consolidate his conquest. The man he left in charge of the city, Pedro de Alvarado, lacked his leader's diplomatic cunning. When the Aztecs requested permission to hold their traditional festival of Toxcatl, honoring the god Tezcatlipoca, Alvarado agreed but grew suspicious of the large gathering. Perhaps fearing a revolt, perhaps simply giving in to Spanish prejudices against Aztec religious practices, he ordered his men to attack the unarmed celebrants in the sacred precinct. The massacre that followed shattered any remaining illusion of Spanish benevolence. The streets of Tenochtitlan erupted in fury. Warriors who had been held back by their emperor's cooperation now poured from every district of the city. The Spanish garrison found itself trapped in the palace complex, surrounded by tens of thousands of enraged Aztecs hurling stones, arrows, and curses at their former guests. When Moctezuma appeared on the palace walls to calm his people, their response was swift and terrible. Stones flew through the air, striking down the emperor who had collaborated with their enemies. Within days, he was dead. Whether from his wounds or Spanish daggers, no one could say for certain. Cortés returned to find his conquest collapsing around him. The city that had welcomed him as a god now sought his destruction with religious fervor. Every street had become a battlefield. Every rooftop bristled with warriors. The causeways that had once seemed like highways to glory now appeared as deadly traps that could be cut at any moment, leaving the Spanish stranded on an island, surrounded by enemies. On the night of the 30th of June 1520, Cortés faced the most desperate decision of his life: stay and face certain annihilation, or attempt a fighting retreat across the dark waters of Lake Texcoco. He chose retreat, and the night that followed would be seared into Spanish memory forever as La Noche Triste, the night of sadness. Under cover of darkness, the Spanish and their remaining Tlaxcalan allies crept through the sleeping city, carrying as much Aztec gold as they could manage. But the Aztecs were waiting. War drums thundered across the lake as thousands of warriors poured onto the causeways. Canoes swarmed the water like angry wasps, their occupants raining arrows and spears down on the fleeing invaders. The wooden bridges had been removed, forcing the Spanish to cross gaps in the causeway under intense fire. Men weighted down with stolen gold sank like stones into the dark water. Horses screamed and thrashed before disappearing beneath the surface. The sound of battle echoed across the Valley of Mexico until dawn revealed the scope of the disaster. Of the force that had entered Tenochtitlan in triumph, barely half survived the retreat. 150 Spanish soldiers lay dead in the lake or on the causeways. 2,000 indigenous allies had perished alongside them. All the cannons were lost. Most of the crossbows and firearms had been abandoned in the flight. The survivors staggered into Tlaxcalan territory, wounded, demoralized, and seemingly defeated. Popular legend claims that Cortés wept beneath a great tree that night, mourning not just his losses but the apparent collapse of his dreams of conquest. Yet even in this darkest hour, the forces that would ultimately doom the Aztec Empire were already at work. As the Spanish nursed their wounds in Tlaxcala, an invisible enemy was spreading through the indigenous population with devastating efficiency. Smallpox, carried by a single infected Spanish soldier, began its merciless march through communities that had never encountered such a disease. The native peoples of the Americas possessed no immunity to old-world diseases. What had been childhood ailments in Europe became apocalyptic plagues in the New World. Smallpox struck with particular savagery, killing not just the weak and elderly but healthy adults in their prime. Entire families died within days of each other. Villages were abandoned as survivors fled the horror, carrying the contagion with them to new communities. In Tenochtitlan, the celebration of Spanish defeat soon turned to horror as the epidemic reached the island capital. An Aztec account captured the unimaginable suffering. The illness was so dreadful that no one could walk or move. The sick were so utterly helpless that they could only lie on their beds like corpses, unable to move their limbs or even lift their heads. Warriors who had driven the Spanish from their city now lay dying in agony, their skin covered with the characteristic pustules that marked the disease's progress. The social fabric of Aztec society began to unravel. The emperor chosen to replace Moctezuma died of the plague within months. The priests who maintained the complex calendar of rituals fell silent. The tribute system that fed the capital broke down as subject cities grappled with their own mortality. What had taken the Aztecs decades to build was crumbling in a matter of months, brought low not by Spanish swords but by microscopic invaders their immune systems could not comprehend. Cortés, watching from Tlaxcala as reports of the epidemic reached him, understood that the balance of power was shifting once again. His military defeat had become a strategic opportunity. The Aztec Empire was wounded, perhaps mortally, and its enemies were multiplying faster than smallpox itself. City-states that had remained neutral or even supported Tenochtitlan now saw weakness where they had once seen strength. The time for his return was approaching, and when it came, he would not make the same mistakes that had cost him so dearly on La Noche Triste. As the plague ravaged the Aztec heartland, Cortés began planning his return with methodical precision. This would not be another desperate gamble, but a calculated campaign of annihilation. In the workshops of Tlaxcala, Spanish carpenters worked alongside indigenous craftsmen to construct something the New World had never seen. 13 shallow draft brigantines, designed specifically for warfare on Lake Texcoco. These vessels would carry cannons and armed men directly to the walls of Tenochtitlan, turning the water that had once protected the city into a highway for its destroyers. The genius of this strategy lay not just in naval innovation, but in the growing coalition that rallied to Cortés's banner. Word of Aztec weakness spread faster than the disease itself, and old grievances demanded satisfaction. The city-states of Texcoco, once loyal allies of Tenochtitlan, declared for the Spanish cause. Their defection was devastating, for they controlled crucial territory around the lake and possessed intimate knowledge of Aztec military tactics. Chalco, Xochimilco, and dozens of other communities that had chafed under Aztec tribute demands saw their chance for revenge. By the spring of 1521, Cortés commanded a force that dwarfed his original expedition. More than 800 Spanish conquistadors had joined his ranks, many recruited from Narváez's defeated force. But the true strength of his army lay in its indigenous component. Tens of thousands of warriors from across central Mexico marched under Spanish banners, united by their hatred of Aztec rule. This was no longer a foreign invasion. It had become a civil war, with the Spanish serving as the catalyst for a rebellion that had been building for generations. The new Aztec emperor Cuauhtémoc was cut from different cloth than his predecessors. Young, fierce, and unburdened by religious doubts about Spanish divinity, he understood that this was a fight for the very survival of his people. Where Moctezuma had hesitated, Cuauhtémoc acted decisively. He fortified the causeways, stockpiled weapons, and prepared his warriors for a siege that would test the limits of human endurance. If Tenochtitlan was to fall, it would not surrender easily. The siege began in earnest in May 1521, and from the first day, it was clear that this would be unlike any conflict the Americas had ever witnessed. Cortés's brigantines dominated the lake, cutting the city's supply lines and preventing reinforcements from reaching the defenders. Spanish cannons thundered from positions on the mainland, sending stone balls crashing into the magnificent buildings that had once filled visitors with wonder. The systematic destruction of Aztec civilization had begun. Yet Cuauhtémoc's warriors fought with a desperation that stunned their enemies. Every street became a battlefield, every building became a fortress. The Aztecs had learned from their earlier encounters with Spanish tactics, adapting their weapons and strategies to counter European advantages. They dug trenches to stop cavalry charges, used captured Spanish weapons against their former owners, and turned the city's complex geography into a maze of death traps. The fighting was brutal beyond description. Spanish accounts tell of advancing through streets carpeted with corpses, of buildings that had to be demolished stone by stone to root out defenders, of water that ran red with blood from the canals. The Aztecs, weakened by famine and disease but driven by desperation, contested every yard of their sacred city. Women fought alongside men. Children carried stones to the ramparts. Priests offered prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned their people. As the weeks turned to months, the siege became a war of attrition that tested the resolve of both sides. Spanish soldiers, despite their technological advantages, found themselves worn down by constant fighting in an urban environment that favored defenders. Many fell not to Aztec weapons, but to diseases that flourished in the unsanitary conditions of siege warfare. Cortés himself was wounded and nearly captured during one of the failed assaults, saved only by the quick thinking of his bodyguards. But time was on the Spanish side. Their supply lines remained open while Tenochtitlan slowly starved. Fresh reinforcements arrived regularly from the coast, while Aztec numbers dwindled with each passing day. Most crucially, the smallpox epidemic continued its relentless work, killing more defenders than Spanish steel ever could. The city that had once boasted 250,000 inhabitants was becoming a charnel house where the living struggled to bury the dead. By August, the end was inevitable. The last Aztec strongholds had been reduced to rubble. The great temples that had dominated the skyline lay in ruins. The canals that had carried fresh water and goods throughout the city now served as mass graves. Cuauhtémoc, wounded and desperate, made a final attempt to escape by canoe under cover of darkness. He was captured on the lake that had once been the source of his empire's strength. On the 13th of August 1521, the last defenders of Tenochtitlan laid down their weapons. The silence that followed must have been deafening after months of constant warfare. Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies walked through streets that had been transformed into a landscape of devastation. The buildings that remained standing were smoke-blackened shells. The sacred precinct where thousands had once gathered for religious ceremonies was a field of rubble. The floating gardens that had fed the city were choked with debris and corpses. The human cost of the siege defied comprehension. Spanish casualties numbered in the hundreds, but Aztec losses were measured in the tens of thousands. Some estimates suggest that as many as 240,000 people died during the final assault, victims of violence, disease, and starvation. The survivors, hollow-eyed and broken, stumbled through the ruins of what had once been the greatest city in the Americas. The smell of death hung over Lake Texcoco like a shroud and would linger for months to come. Cortés stood in the ruins of Moctezuma's palace, master of an empire that no longer existed. The gold he had dreamed of proved largely illusory. Much of it had been lost during La Noche Triste, and the rest had been spent on the long campaign. The real treasure of the Aztecs, their art, their architecture, their accumulated knowledge of centuries, lay scattered and broken around him. He had won one of history's most complete victories, but at a price that even he seemed to recognize was almost beyond measure. The Spanish began the work of building their new colonial capital on the bones of the old Aztec city. Churches rose where temples had stood. Spanish homes occupied the sites of indigenous palaces. The very stones of Tenochtitlan were recycled into the foundations of what would become Mexico City. It was a deliberate act of cultural erasure, designed to bury the memory of Aztec greatness beneath Spanish civilization. Yet even as the physical traces of the old empire disappeared, the consequences of its fall rippled outward across the continent. News of Spanish victory reached other indigenous kingdoms, carrying with it the terrible lesson of what resistance might cost. Some chose to submit without fighting, hoping to preserve something of their culture under Spanish rule. Others prepared for wars they knew they could not win, determined to die with honor rather than live as subjects. The diseases that had proved so devastating to the Aztecs continued their march across the New World, leaving a trail of empty villages and abandoned cities in their wake. Populations that had numbered in the millions were reduced to mere thousands. Entire peoples vanished from history, leaving behind only archaeological traces of their existence. The demographic catastrophe that began with Cortés would continue for generations, reshaping the human landscape of the Americas in ways that are still felt today. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked more than the end of an empire. It was the collision of two worlds, where Spanish steel and indigenous resentment combined with microscopic invaders to topple a civilization that had endured for centuries. The Aztec Empire fell not because of Spanish superiority, but because of a perfect storm of disease, betrayal, and strategic brilliance that no amount of courage could overcome. From the ashes of this once mighty realm would rise a new world, forever changed by the echoes of conquest.